Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is October 27th, 2023, Friday, October 27th, 2023. We're coming down the home stretch for Halloween, and let's go to our first story. All right, this is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Cursed Women. Many of these creations on canvas are at times described by the artist as being inspired from something outside themselves. Are they portraits or portals? First one that we're looking at, it's called The Rain Woman. Ukrainian artist Svetlana Telets was a newly minted artist who graduated in 1996 from Grekov Odessa Art School. Then she started to suffer nightmares and the feeling of being watched by someone or something. The spell she had endured for 6 months was broken one day when she took her paintbrush and produced the painting The Rain Woman in only 5 hours. She had never seen this subject before. She said the following: I always felt like someone was watching me. I always drove such thoughts away. Then one day, by the way, it wasn't a rainy day at all. I was sitting in front of a black canvas and thought of what I could draw. Suddenly, I saw clearly the contours of a woman, her face, colors, shades. I saw every detail of the image. I started to draw it as if someone drove my hand over the paper. In 5 hours, I managed to finish it. She exhibited in Venezia at a local salon. Connoisseurs came up to her and shared the same impressions she had felt while she worked on it. The portrait sold quickly. The customer was a businesswoman who hung it in her bedroom. Within 2 weeks, Svetlana heard from the woman was frightened. She said, "Please pick her up. I cannot sleep. It seems there is someone in the apartment besides me. I even took it off the wall and hid it behind the closet, but I still can't do it." The second person to bring it home hung it in his living room. He found that he soon couldn't stand the portrait. He returned it and took only half of what he paid for it. He said, "I dream about her. Every night she appears and follows me like a shadow." Another man, a skeptic, had already seen the painting before he bought it. His skepticism turned into fear when he started to see the lady with her white eyes everywhere. When he returned it to the salon, he said, "At first I didn't notice how white her eyes were, and then they started appearing everywhere. It seemed that a little more and I would drown in them. I'd rather buy something classic." It hung at the Venezia Salon Merkex Furniture in Kiev. Customers who visited the shop claimed that sometimes you could catch the painting smiling, and to some there was often a glance of anger. The publication KP asked the artist if she was looking for a new owner. She said, quote, "I'm in no hurry. I am sure that each painting is born for a specific person. I believe that for my woman, there will be someone for who it was painted. I understand that many people don't need this melancholy in her eyes now. It's just not interior design, but someone is looking for her, just like she's looking for them." End quote. According to Archpriest Vitaly Goloskevich, a priest at the Transfiguration Cathedral Venezia said, quote, "A person has a spirit and a soul. They are truly spiritual works of art, and they are spiritual ones. And the painting you are talking about represents just such a soulful art, but it does not come from God. Before buying a painting, I would advise you to listen to yourself, to your feelings that remain after contemplating the creation." The artist put into the work the mood in which she was in at the time. It is unknown who directed the artist at that moment. Therefore, if it was something unclean, then even consecrating the painting will not help. In 2008, Sergei Skakov, frontman of the group Zemlane, which translates to Earthlings, wrote about the painting while flying to a concert in Kiev. The painting appeared on the cover of Komsomolskaya Pravda. He read the painting had been looking for an owner for 11 years. This is when he decided it should belong to him. Svetlana was asked to take the portrait to Kiev for the new customer. She said, "I approached the woman and mentally asked, if you want to live with this musician, make sure everything works out. And I felt her silent consent." She turned the painting over to the musician at a hotel with the impression that she herself wanted to leave me. Is the painting cursed, or is it a question that the buyers were primed to believe it was evil? The next painting is titled, a real long title, Portrait of Miss Henrietta Nelson in a blue and white gown and white hat holding a rose in a rococo interior. This is the title of it. Henrietta is the real person. Henrietta came to Yaxley Hall in England in 1739 when she was 5 years old to live with her great aunt Margaret Leake after her parents died in a carriage accident. A few years before, in 1727, Robert Yaxley was found almost dead on the road with his skull broken and his pockets turned out. He was not expected to live. This is when the Leakes came to Yaxley Hall. Henrietta's portrait was painted in 1780 by William Johnson. She was only 46 years old when she posed for it and lived many more years until 1816, when she died after falling down a flight of stairs from her bedroom. The unmarried spinster was 82 years old. Fulfilling her wishes, her cousin, Frances Leake, built a private mausoleum for her on the grounds of Yaxley Hall. Frances died in 1836, and his daughter and her husband decided to move and dismantle the mausoleum. They replaced her remains in the graveyard of the nearby Church of St. Mary, which dates back to medieval times. Her portrait hung at the home of a family friend in Norfolk for many years. That's when people said the woman in the painting was watching them. It went to other places and was gone almost a century before the portrait was returned to Yaxley Hall. Perhaps her absence did serve a purpose, since the manor, built in 1520, had two wings burned down in 1922. A ghost fitting Henrietta's appearance in the painting is said to be seen on the grounds. The reason she is said not to lie quiet in her grave is due to the destruction of the mausoleum. I read a little bit about this. What happened was the rest of the family had a vault at the church, and Henrietta specifically asked for that mausoleum to be built just for her, right there next to Yaxley Hall, right? Which is possibly why they decided to dismantle it, because it was right next to the actual hall versus, many of these families, they would have vaults or mausoleums or things at the church that was nearby. But and supposedly that is what triggered the haunting, was when they dismantled her mausoleum. The next story is titled Portrait of a Lady, which is the title of the portrait. The lady in question is Paz Pardo de Tavera, the wife of the artist Juan Luna. He produced the work in 1890. This was 2 years before he murdered his 28-year-old wife. The painting is said to cause misfortune and death to anyone who owns it. The source is said to be the spirit of Paz. She brought death in car accidents, misfortune in finances, miscarriages, and ill health. Juan Luna de San Pedro y Novicio Ancheta was a Filipino artist born in 1857. He would go on to study art in Europe and lived in poverty while producing many of his famous works, until he won prizes for some of his paintings. In Paris, he rubbed elbows with Filipino artists and intellectuals, among them Trinidad and Felix Pardo de Tavera, who would eventually introduce him to their sister. In 1886, he married Maria de la Paz Pardo de Tavera and Goricho, who was born in the Philippines, a mestiza of Spanish-Portuguese extraction. She belonged to a very wealthy political family in self-exile from the Philippines and had lived most of her life in Paris. Her mother did not approve of the match, but was convinced by her sons. In the 6 years of their marriage, Juan and Paz had two children, Andres and Maria de la Paz. In 1892, Luna lived with his wife, her two brothers, and his mother-in-law at Villa Dupont on Rue Pergolese in Paris. Next to the cottage, Luna had his atelier or studio where he worked on his paintings. There are various versions of what happened in September of that year, but one thing is certain, which it was precipitated by Luna suspecting his wife was unfaithful to him. She had spent 2 months in Mont d'Or recovering from the death of their daughter, Bibi. Upon her return, he threatened her with a revolver, but she admitted nothing. However, of one thing he was convinced, which was that his wife did not love him any longer. He told her they, along with their son Andres, would leave for Spain. It was said that Paz was terrified of her now paranoid and violent husband, and she was convinced by her family to stay in Paris and obtain a separation from Luna. Whether she didn't want to leave in the first place, or she was convinced by her family, on the day they were to leave and the luggage was packed, Luna came to the house and found a solicitor waiting with his two brother-in-laws. Later, he told the police the following story. Quote, his wife and mother-in-law were locked in the bedroom upstairs. Then he heard them crying out from a window, "Help, help, my husband wishes to kill me." I understood it all. I was caught in a trap. My wife and mother-in-law wished to pretend that I struck them, and the solicitor and my two brother-in-laws who were below in the garden were there as witnesses. Then my wife, her mother, and her brothers would gain their point, namely, be able to issue against me a writ of divorce. End quote. After finding the bedroom locked, he went downstairs and grabbed a revolver. He shot one of his brother-in-laws, Felix Pardo de Tavera, who was wounded and would survive. He broke down the bathroom door. He broke down the bedroom door and then the bathroom door where both women were hiding and shot them both. His mother-in-law died instantly, and his wife, who was shot in the head, would linger 2 weeks before dying. Luna tried to shoot himself, but a servant took the gun from him. Later, Luna admitted he was prey to intense jealousy when it came to his wife. It was rumored that he had no money and the family was kept by his mother-in-law. Police arrested him and he went to trial for the crime in February of 1893. Like the murder, there are two versions to the outcome. In one, he was acquitted and he moved to Madrid 5 days later. In the other, he was found guilty, but because it was a crime of passion, he was given a light sentence, which was banishment from Paris. He left to the San Andres, 5 years old, who witnessed the murder since he was in the bathroom when his mother and grandmother were shot. It was rumored that Dr. Trinidad Pardo de Tavera decided to burn all of Luna's paintings in his possession, and for years there would be none of his works in any Pardo de Tavera household. The doctor continued to live in Paris and died in 1925. He is buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery. Luna returned to the Philippines in 1894 and he was arrested in 1896 for sedition. His brother belonged to the Katipunan movement, who were described in the newspapers at the time as a murderous secret society whose object it was to secure the freedom of the Philippines by putting to the sword all the Spaniards in the archipelago. Luna was pardoned and left for Spain. 5 years after he killed his wife, Juan Luna died on December 7, 1899, in Hong Kong when he heard of his brother's death at the hands of soldiers loyal to General Emilio Aguinaldo. He was 42 and buried at Happy Valley Cemetery, but in 1920 his remains were removed and kept at his son's house and later transferred to a niche at the crypt chapel of San Agustin. The portrait was originally titled Paz Pardo de Tavera before it was changed to Portrait of a Lady. How the painting made its way back to Manila is a mystery, and the nexus of its curse remains just as obscure. Its first owner, Manuel Garcia, sold it after business took a downturn. There was mention of a couple who owned it in 1980, and their house in Forbes Park burned down, but the painting was saved. Then it came into the hands of Betty Bantung Benitez, who died in a freak automobile accident in 1981 when a car she was a passenger in drove off the road and hit a tree. Vicky and Tony Nazarino purchased it next, and soon after the family closed one of its biggest stores. Then Tony got sick when his carotid artery got swollen, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was producing this symptom. He also started to experience high blood pressure. Eventually, the couple would separate, and Tony Nazarino's condition got worse. He died in 2005. The painting was exhibited at art shows during the 1980s. This is when Imelda Marcos saw and acquired it. It was hanging in the office of the Philippine president when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated in 1983. Aquino was a political opponent of President Ferdinand Marcos, who would be exiled in 1986. Then it went to the home of Ime Marcos Manotoc, during which time it is said she suffered a miscarriage. Susano June Gonzalez, a famous art restoration expert from the 1970s and 80s, did work on the Luna portrait. He would be gruesomely murdered about a dozen years after he worked on it. It was donated to the Metropolitan Museum in 1986, and on the opening night in 1987, the spotlight over it exploded. No other lighting in the museum behaved this way. One of the biggest mysteries is that the lady in the portrait doesn't look like Paz Pardo de Tavera. Her skin color is too light, which leads some to believe it was a favorite model of Luna's named Mademoiselle Angela Douche. Others believe she is an idealized version of Paz. But would a jealous man like Juan Luna paint his wife with a partially exposed breast? Another portrait produced in 1892, the year Luna would kill his wife, titled The Parisian Life, has an unnamed model who again some believe are his wife or Angela. Juan and Paz's son Andre Luling Luna de San Pedro would go on to become a successful architect. He designed the Crystal Arcade, which was inaugurated in 1932, built on land owned by his maternal family. During World War II, more than 80% of Manila's structures were destroyed. The Crystal Arcade was located in the area of the most fierce combat. After the war, the first floor was occupied by stores and the second floor was used for storage. It never regained the elegance of its original design and was razed in the 1960s. Some believe that the structure was burned down because Luling kept the urn of his father's ashes there. So, I mean, you could just call it bad luck in the sense of, things happen, but apparently they seem to think that there's like something there to follow, you know, something there happened that's you can blame it on the paintings. Now, this is another article. This is out of AP and it's titled Experts Reconstruct the Face of Peru's Most Famous Mummy, a Teenage Inca Sacrificed in the Andean Snow. Which, by the way, the quality of these reconstructions are getting wonderful. Um, the possible living face of Peru's most famous mummy, a teenage Inca girl sacrificed in a ritual more than 500 years ago atop the Andes, was unveiled Tuesday, as in 3 days ago, October 24th. The silicone made bust portrays a young woman with pronounced cheekbones, black eyes, and tan skin. Produced by a team of Polish and Peruvian scientists who worked with a Swedish sculptor specializing in facial reconstructions, it was presented in a ceremony at the Andean Sanctuaries Museum of the Catholic University of Santa Maria in Arequipa. I thought I'd never know what her face looked like when she was alive, said Johann Reinhardt, the U.S. anthropologist who found the mummy known as Juanita and the Inca Ice Maiden. Reinhardt discovered the mummy in 1995 at an altitude of more than 6,000 meters, which is equivalent to 19,685 feet on the snow-capped Ampato volcano. Now, 28 years later, this has become a reality thanks to Oscar Nilsson's reconstruction, he said. Nilsson, a Swedish archaeologist and sculptor who specializes in 3D facial reconstructions of ancient humans, told the Associated Press in an email that it took him about 400 hours of work to model the face. Dagmara Socha, a Polish bioarchaeologist at the University of Warsaw Center for Andean Studies, said at the ceremony that the first step in achieving Juanita's face was to obtain a replica of the skull. Then body scans, DNA studies, ethnological characteristics, age, complexion were used in the facial reconstruction, the university said in a statement. According to anthropological studies, Juanita was sacrificed between AD 1440 and 1450 when she was between 13 and 15 years old. She was 5.5 inches tall, weighed, no, I'm sorry, she was 55 inches tall and weighed about 77 pounds and was well nourished. 77 pounds? Okay. The probable cause of death was a severe blow to the right occipital lobe, according to researchers at Johns Hopkins University who performed a CT scan. Reinhardt, who has uncovered more than 14 Inca human sacrifices high in the Andes, including 3 children in an icy pit at Argentina's Huillaco volcano, said scientists have been investigating aspects of Juanita's life, such as her diet and the objects found next to her. These findings have helped us better understand her life and the Inca culture, he said. Now we can see what she really looked like, which makes her even more alive. And that's her face right there for those that are watching the video. But if you look at her, she's very typical. If you write right now to Peru, what the native people of Peru look like. You could tell she looks like, I mean, you could probably go now and you'd find a bunch of people, girls that look like her running around there. All right. Next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Last Resting Place of the Boy Bandit King. On August 30th, 1950, a tombstone with the inscription, The Boy Bandit King, he died as he lived, disappeared from a grave in the old Fort Sumner Cemetery. It was also described with Truth and History 21 men. Below this were crossed revolvers. Fort Sumner was a military post in the 1860s. It was established on the east bank of the Pecos River in New Mexico. As many as 700 infantry and cavalry troops were stationed at the fort until 1869, then it was abandoned. The buildings and land were purchased by Lucien B. Maxwell. He lived there until his death in 1875. Present day, there is no trace left of the adobe buildings that made up old Fort Sumner. In 1907, the remains of soldiers who were buried there were moved to the National Cemetery in Santa Fe. Some say that Billy the Kid's remains were mistaken for those of a soldier and moved as well. Graves of pioneers were left behind. During the 1930s, the old cemetery was preserved through the efforts of Adelina Wellborn, Peter Maxwell's granddaughter. However, if there is any possibility that the kid's body was moved elsewhere, it would make the following antics quite ironic. In 1940, a black tombstone was erected to mark the last resting place of Billy the Kid. Perhaps the summit represented a time when an outlaw could become a hero. No doubt this allure is what prompted the robbery of the memorial in 1951. Enclosed by a 7-foot steel fence and weighing at least 100 pounds, the robbery had to be carried out by more than one person. For 26 years, no one knew where the tombstone was at, until a Mr. and Mrs. Branham, who were visiting the museum, told an employee where it could be found in a field near a ranch in Granbury, Texas. The town lies about 60 miles southwest of Dallas. Authorities, when asked, said that for years it served as a local curiosity for the town, after it was accidentally discovered by a local resident. Joe Boland, who owned the Fort Sumner Museum, brought it back to the cemetery in 1976. On February 3, 1981, someone took a crowbar to the fence and carried away the granite tombstone on the centennial year of the kid's death. 10 days later, the Debaca County Police received an anonymous tip it could be found in a house on Delaware Street in Huntington Beach, California. They found it in a bedroom of a house belonging to Walter Nicholson, age 25. Big Jim McBride, a Debaca County sheriff, flew to Los Angeles to bring it back to New Mexico. Once recovered, iron shackles were used to keep it in place. There is another version of what happened at the midnight hour in Pete Maxwell's bedroom in August 1881 that again might put in doubt who exactly lies under the memorial in Fort Sumner Cemetery. Some believe that William Bonney was spared by Pat Garrett and that a derelict was supposedly buried in the kid's place. The outlaw disappeared into anonymity, taking on the name of Ollie L. Roberts, better known in the Texas town of Hico as Brushy Bill. He died in 1950 at the age of 90. During the 1960s, C.S. Holmes of Clovis obtained a copy of an old grand jury indictment issued in Seymour, Texas. It was filed in Hardeman County, Texas on December 28, 1881, charging a man of murder. Witnesses who testified were listed as W.A. Tackett, Jack Grisham, Billy the Kid, and Sam Watson. Considering this was 4 months after Pat Garrett put Henry Bonney in his grave, either this was an impostor or someone else had been buried on August 15, 1881. Jimmy Ramey, a school principal in Hico, said during a phone interview in February of 1981 that he remembered an old man who lived in the town during the 1940s who said he was Billy the Kid. Most knew him as Brushy Billy, recognizable with his large hat, plaid shirt, a handlebar mustache, and a gray beard. He wasn't a tall man, maybe 5 feet 7 inches, and occasionally he would chew on tobacco. Most of the town smiled and nodded their head when Brushy Billy would talk about being Billy the Kid, but just dismissed it as flights of imagination from an eccentric old man. Charles Machen grew up in Hico and remembered Brushy Billy. His wife described the story her husband recounted. He, Brushy Billy, supposedly went to Santa Fe in the 1940s to get a pardon from the governor. They wouldn't issue a pardon to him until they found out if he was really Billy the Kid. They brought a Mexican man who was familiar with Billy the Kid to meet Brushy Billy. Henry Bonney's one-time friend said the old man had to be Billy because he knew secrets only the kid would have known. However, this did not get Brushy his pardon, and he returned to Hico. The old man never owned a car and instead rode a painted horse until the day he died. He had bucked teeth and speckled eyes, and old age did not rob him of his ramrod posture. Brushy Billy had to compete with another man named John Miller, who was said to be the kid. Miller never publicly claimed the identity of William H. McCarty. Only after his death did friends and acquaintances speak of his stories and his unusual behavior through the years. John Miller is first found in historical records on August 8, 1881, a few days after Billy the Kid was said to be killed by Pat Garrett. On that date, he married a girl named Isadora in Las Vegas, New Mexico territory. At the ceremony, he carried a gun on his hip and appeared to have a fresh bullet wound in his chest. This was visible through his shirt. The couple left town right after the wedding and headed west. Miller rode a horse along with 7 head of cattle, and his wife followed with a fully loaded wagon. They traveled at night and slept during the day, stopping at Albuquerque before continuing west until they came to El Morro. They stopped at the mining town of Reserve where Miller nursed his wounds. Once recovered, Miller with his wife in tow went to the Quemado area where he worked as a cook at Nation's Ranch. A gunfight broke out between Miller and a Mexican ranch hand. Neither was wounded, but Miller lost his job. The couple returned to El Morro, then continued to the Zuni Mountains in the New Mexico territory. Along the way, they met Jesus Iracho, a cattleman who hired Miller to look after a large herd. The deal Iracho made with him was that at the end of 5 years, Miller could keep half of the new cattle born during those years. The couple kept to themselves, living in caves or squatting in abandoned homestead. At the end of 5 years, Iracho kept his word, and Miller built a house and a ranch south of Rama in a place that would become known as Miller's Canyon. In the years that followed, Miller prospered as a rancher. The couple were well liked by the community in the Rama Zuni area. However, Miller never failed to wear a pistol and keep a loaded rifle by the door of his house. His friends witnessed his skill with a pistol, and later they described where Miller would tell stories of Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. He also showed them various bullet scars he had on his body. He demonstrated he could get out of being tied up as well. Despite Miller's denial that he was Billy the Kid, many of his friends came to believe he was. A few times, when he was drunk, he would say he was the kid, only to deny it once he was sober. His wife Isadora did say he was Billy the Kid. The couple had a chest they always kept locked, and which some suspected contained the proof of Miller's true identity. Around the turn of the century, the couple adopted a 6-year-old Navajo boy, which was left abandoned by his mother in the forest. In the 1910 census, he's 16 years old, and his name is Roman. In later records, he's referred to as Max. The childless couple raised him as their own. At that time, they were living in Valencia County, New Mexico. Wherever there are cattle, there are rustlers, and many times Miller acted as an intermediary between the outlaws and the ranchers. He would bargain with them for the return of the stolen animals. Some saw this as a familiarity with dealing with outlaws. One neighbor said that in 1902, Miller, along with 6 outlaws, traveled to Montana where they robbed a bank of $8,000. In 1918, pestilence and drought visited the land, and Isadora was losing her eyesight. She also had a hand injury, and Miller was suffering from rheumatism. Their ranch was just about ruined. Their son Max, who had joined the U.S. Army, was listed as missing in action in Germany. The couple gathered their things and headed to the small town of San Simon in Arizona. Max did not die and turned up after being discharged from the service. 2 years later, in search of easing Miller's rheumatism, they moved to the town of Buckeye, which was known for its mineral springs. Miller worked as a horse trainer and soon saved enough money to build another ranch near the town of Liberty. The couple were popular among the neighbors, who also came to believe he was Billy the Kid. Towards the end of the 1920s, the Miller home caught fire with Isadora inside. She was pulled out, but she was dead probably from smoke inhalation. After his wife's death, Miller's health deteriorated. He fell from a roof he was repairing, and his son took him to the Pioneer home in Prescott, where he was admitted in 1937. Sensing his end was near, it was said Miller tried several times to have his son or his friends visit so he could set the record straight, but perhaps they thought there was some more time. He died on November 7, 1937, and was buried with other pioneers in the Pioneer Home Cemetery. After his death, the trunk Isadora and him had carried with them through their travels became the property of the courts in Phoenix. A court representative went to Rama looking for Miller's heir. He interviewed several Miller's friends and allegedly told them the contents of the trunk proved he was Billy the Kid. They couldn't locate Max, and the current whereabouts of the trunk are unknown. In 2005, John Miller's DNA was obtained in order to compare it with blood traces taken from a bench where supposedly the kid's body was placed after being shot by Pat Garrett. The bench was discovered on a Fort Sumner ranch. The results have not been made public. The other McCartys. What many people forget is that when the kid's mother, Catherine McCarty nee Devine, left New York, she had two sons, Henry and Joseph. Joseph was born in 1863, making him the kid's younger brother. Their father, Patrick McCarty, died in 1865. Catherine McCarty moved out west to Kansas and ran a laundry. From there, she went to New Mexico. She married William Antrim in Santa Fe in 1873. She died the following year from tuberculosis. Joseph, Joseph adopted his stepfather's surname and was known throughout his life as Joe Antrim. When Billy the Kid was killed in July of 1881, his brother was living in Trinidad, Colorado. It was reported that Joe Antrim threatened to shoot Garrett to avenge his brother's death. Antrim and Garrett came face to face 2 years later in the billiards room of the Admijo House on Albuquerque Hotel at the corner of 3rd and Railroad, which is now Central Avenue. When asked about the encounter, Garrett said that Antrim had denied that he harbored any ill will against him. I told Antrim I had only done my duty and should not be hated for it, and we parted the best of friends. In 1883, Joe Antrim was a cook in an Albuquerque hotel, and later he was a bartender in El Paso. From there, he drifted to Colorado. In 1908, Joseph Antrim was working as a runner for poker games. He spent the rest of his life in Colorado on the gambling hall circuit. He kept the fact that he was Billy the Kid's brother a secret. He died of apoplexy at the Old Murphy House, a gambling den, at 1617 Latimer Street, Denver, on November 25, 1930. His body went unclaimed and he was sent to the Colorado Medical School for dissection. William Henry Harrison Antrim, Henry and Joseph's stepfather, died in 1922. The biggest surprise of all is that Henry and Joseph had an older sister named Bridget, born in 1853. She appeared in the 1855 census. What became of her is unknown. There you go. That's the boy bandit queen. King, I'm sorry. Oh, that's a bad thing to say. He's not a queen, he was a king. You know, many stories, a lot of legends around Billy the Kid. Now, this other story is out of Daily Mail, and it's titled, and this is by the way, this case is a very well-known poltergeist case. Newfield and Enfield Poltergeist cases, photographer who took infamous levitating girl image denies saying she just jumped and insists 4 decades on he absolutely believes she had some sort of force. The photographer who famously took a picture of a girl levitating at an Enfield home, supposedly being haunted by a poltergeist, denies saying she just jumped and believes she may have had telekinesis powers like Stephen King's Carrie. The Hodgson family was at the center of a media frenzy during the 1970s, when its council homes at 284 Green Street was supposedly being haunted by former tenant Bill Wilkins, who had died there. Single mother of four, Peggy Hodgson's 11-year-old daughter, Janet, was at the epicenter of the unknown forces supposedly within the home, with furniture flying around and Bill's rasping voice being channeled through the young girl. The Enfield Poltergeist phenomena was the inspiration for Hollywood horror movie The Conjuring 2, multiple documentaries, and next month we'll see the Enfield Haunting starring Catherine Tate open at the West End. Photographer Graham Morris, who was in his 20s when in 1977, while working for the Daily Mirror, he was sent with a reporter to the semi-detached home at around midnight after their neighbors Vic and Peggy Nottingham called pleading for help when the terrified Hodgson family had sought refuge with them. The family were brought back to their home, but it was only when Janet walked in that eerie things began to happen. The now 69-year-old, the newspaper. Bang, things started flying all over the place, he said. I'm in the corner looking through my lens. I can see everything. No one is throwing this stuff. No one is doing anything. They're not trying to do anything or for fun or for laughs or whatever. They were all, particularly the kids, absolutely horrified. Terrified Janet, the 13-year-old sister Margaret, and Billy 7 began screaming, crying, and biting their fingernails while a Lego brick flew and hit Mr. Morris in the head, leaving a nasty lump above his right eye for 4 days. Their brother Johnny 10 was at boarding school at the time. Fascinated by what happened, over the next 18 months the skeptical Mr. Morris returned to the home, even when the Mirror dropped the story, for up to 4 nights a week, and would sometimes help the children with their homework. The family's problems meant bright Janet was barely able to communicate with her siblings and mother, with her sister crying whenever she was spoken to. The Society for Psychical Research, SPR, full of very bright blokes, got involved to document what happened, with experts from universities also trying to solve what was happening with the family, desperate for it to end. A cast iron bed was tipped on its side and a fireplace was torn from the wall. But the researchers' attention was drawn towards Janet when they say they discovered she was levitating. Keen to prove their theory, a camera was set up on a tripod in the corner of the children's bedroom, which was triggered by a button on a long cable which ran down to the living room, with an audio recording also being taken. As soon as I heard there's anything like a bed spring goes twang, or somebody moans or screams, a bang or crash, anything, I hit the button, Mr. Morris said. It is through this that the famous picture seen across the world of Janet supposedly levitating and flying through the air was taken. Mr. Morris recalled hearing a scream or a shout, and then nothing for a second before a huge crash. There is no way she was doing this for fun, he said. You have got to be mad to actually want to do something like that. It was a completely darkened room. If it were the case she were jumping, she'd be launching herself at a brick wall or a door in pitch black. They ran upstairs to find Janet in a mess, crumpled on the floor on the other side of the bedroom. He denies he ever said she was jumping, and he left it to the experts at the SPR to decide whether she was levitating or not. Mr. Morris had his own theory behind it and openly admits he does not believe in ghosts. I think this girl has some sort of force, he said. He believes the house wasn't haunted, as things would happen whenever Janet was there, whether it was at school, her neighbors' homes, or at the shops. Instead, he likened it to Stephen King's character Carrie, who can move things with her mind through harnessing her telekinesis powers. Janet has got the sort of kinetic energy. She's really bright, he said. As I said, she can't talk to her dad. He's not there. Mom's too busy. Her sister cries. One brother has a speech impediment, so bad I doubt she can even understand what he says. And the other brother is at a special school. And she is desperate to get this, whatever it is, this energy, this power, whatever she has, across and out to communicate with people. And it's coming out in different ways in a sort of force, like a kinetic energy where things are shifting around. He doesn't think the mystery of the Enfield Poltergeist will be solved in his lifetime, but when it is 100 years from now, it will be looked upon as something simple. Mr. Morris didn't talk to anyone about what was happening at Green Street, with his own family only discovering his involvement when they saw him in a documentary. The whole thing was too wacky, too weird, just too way out, he said. Everybody who heard about it wanted to be there to see it for themselves. They wouldn't take anybody's word for it. You just had to witness it yourself. I have very good friends, relatives, and all sorts. They believe everything you say, but they still had to go and see, and they wouldn't take my word for it or the pictures. It was turning, I'm afraid, into a Victorian freak show. The year and a half snapping creepy photos at Green Street has stayed etched in Mr. Morris's mind for the last 4 decades. Nothing like that had ever happened before or since, he says, before audibly puffing out a rapid breath. It was just the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me, and that's why I wanted to stay there and see it through and find out what it was, for me as much as anything else. Although initially spooked on the first day having witnessed things floating and flying around, he feels the period hardened him from being a kid scared of the dark to feeling fairly bulletproof to most things. He chuckled. You see these strange programs on TV saying, go sleep in a haunted house, and you think, hey, bring it on. It's got to be a piece of cake after Enfield. Instead, he takes a scientific approach to things and laughs at Halloween movies. He even says he probably gets thrown out of the latest West End production of the Enfield haunting for giggling at the audience. This Enfield wasn't Hollywood, he said. They didn't have CGI. The Hodgson family weren't faking it. There you go. Mr. Morris added, there's something going on in that house which we haven't discovered yet. We haven't worked out what it is or how it happened. When it does, it'll probably make us all look rather stupid, and we will go, silly me, why didn't I think of that? And that's the same thing. We just don't know. In years to come, we will all be doing it, teleporting or moving things with our fingers 10 yards away, but we just don't understand it. I don't know how it works or how it happens, but I knew at the time that the kids were not making these things happen intentionally. There might be some power or some force or some brainwave that's coming from one of them. Janet. Interesting. So, of course, I didn't know that they were going to do a movie version of this. And it looks like, yeah, they've got some pretty big stars that are going to be starting in it. That'll be interesting. What comes of that? You know, everybody. Hmm. All right. Next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and it's titled Disturbed Paintings. This painting thing there, I mean, it's like makes you think twice when you pick up some paintings, like, do I really want this? Some paintings, by the effect they have on the subjects portrayed or those who view them, are known as disturbed. They carry the essence of the artist that in some instances turn out to be unlucky or plain deadly. The first artist is Arshil Gorky. Arshil Gorky, born Bostanik Manug Adoyan, is an Armenian-American artist born in 1904 in a village on the shores of Lake Van in the Ottoman Empire, which is present-day Turkey. His mother starved to death in 1919 while living in Yerevan, Armenia. As Armenian Christians, they were a minority who were oppressed by the Ottoman and later by the Turkish rulers. His mother, Sushan, was married at 14, and she witnessed when her young husband was murdered by Turkish soldiers for being part of a rebel force. When she was 19, she was wedded to a widower, Sedrak Adoyan, 36. They had 3 children, and Gorky, being the only boy, was favored by his mother. She expected him to become a poet or a priest, but she also warned him that he would suffer a dark fate. She called him, quote, the black one, the unlucky one who will come to a no good end, end quote. As an adult, he called it the family curse. And he was her favorite. Makes you wonder what she told the ones that weren't her favorite. In 1920, he arrived in America and went to see his father, who had abandoned the family in 1908 and moved to Rhode Island. 3 years later, Gorky enrolled in the New York School of Art in Boston, but he was mostly self-educated. He was romantically involved with artist Corinne West, but in 1941 he married Agnes Magruder, a wealthy socialite 20 years his junior. His pet name for her was Moguch, an Armenian endearment. As a true bohemian, she had moved in with him prior to their marriage. It seemed he was doomed to relive a pattern of abandonment with his choice of spouse. She said of the relationship, quote, I told them that I felt it was quite impossible to be faithful, how one person couldn't be all things to everybody from birth to death. Surely there were all sorts of facets to everybody's personality. When I first went to live with him, I couldn't understand what I'd done. It was all right then because I had a bolt hole. I could go and see my parents or my grandfather in Cape Cod. I could do things, couldn't I? But once I was married, well, he didn't want me to go out anymore, working nights or days. End quote. 1946 was not a good year for Gorky. His studio, housed in a barn, burnt down, taking 30 of his paintings and his library. It seemed that this was a family tradition. His grandmother had set the local church on fire in revolt against God, who had allowed her son to be tortured by the Turks. So when his studio was burning, he acted as if under the curse, not informing the fire brigade but trying to staunch the flames himself. After the fire, he painted an homage to the works he lost, naming two of his paintings Charred Beloved 1 and Charred Beloved 2. In 1947, he underwent surgery for a colostomy for rectal cancer, and his estranged father died. During that time, his wife had an affair with fellow artist and friend Robert Mata. His wife left in the summer of 1948 with her 2 young daughters as she could no longer cope with her husband's depression and his increasing violence. She would go on to marry writer Zan Fielding. The same week she left, he was a passenger in a car driven by gallery owner Julian Levy, who crashed while under the influence of alcohol. Gorky's neck and back were broken, and he had to wear a neck brace. It temporarily paralyzed his painting arm. On July 19th, he returned home, driven by Isamu Noguchi, as well as Wilfredo Lamb and his wife Helena. On the way, Gorky asked to stop to see Dr. Wife, his psychiatrist. When he got back in the car, he told Noguchi that the doctor wants to perform a lobotomy on me. All right. On July 21st, 1948, he told the students and a neighbor he meant to kill himself. He took off his neck brace and hung himself from the rafters of his barn studio in Connecticut. He wrote, Goodbye, my loveds, in chalk on a wooden crate. Ironically, a few weeks before, Life magazine had written a story about his barn studio. His barking dog brought a neighbor to the barn where his body was discovered. After Gorky died, Magruder traveled Europe with Mata, placing her children in a Swiss boarding school rather than allowing Gorky's sister in Chicago to adopt them. Was there something about Gorky's ill fortune which imbued his art? There are rumors that his paintings produced from 1904 to 1938 were cursed. In 2003, an Armenian activist told a researcher, quote, "Have you ever heard of Gorky's curse? There's a rumor going around the galleries of New York that Gorky's paintings are cursed. The painting, The Orators, has been damaged in a fire in 1957. Another painting, The Calendars, has been completely destroyed. There are even rumors of paintings falling from walls and of a black-haired ghost in a blue overcoat that visits Gorky's old house in Sherman, Connecticut. The art dealers I have spoken with in New York are absolutely convinced that the work of Gorky is haunted." End quote. On March 1st, 1962, 15 of Gorky's paintings were on American Airlines Flight 1 to Los Angeles for an exhibition. 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane rolled over and crashed into a swamp, taking 87 passengers, 8 crew members, and Gorky's paintings into a muddy grave. Among the passengers were Admiral Richard Lansing Connolly, a retired Chief of Naval Operations, George T. Felbeck, VP of Union Carbide, W. Alton Jones, former president and chairman of City Service Company and friend of Dwight D. Eisenhower, Louise Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame, whose daughter Linda would go on to marry Paul McCartney, and Emmeline Whitten, 1952 Olympic sailing gold medalist. In 1937, Gorski painted a portrait of his friend and fellow artist, Anna Wolinska. It would hang in her family's home for many years and was never publicly exhibited. The portrait was sold by Wolinska in the late 1970s when her rent-stabilized apartment was converted into a co-op and she needed funds. The Bodley Gallery accepted it for consignment, but it didn't sell. An auction at Sotheby's failed to produce a buyer as well. A private broker at Sotheby's found a buyer where it was sold for next to nothing. It is one of about 50 of Gorky's paintings that have been lost through the years. In 2021, underneath one of Gorky's paintings, The Limit, produced in 1947, Gorky's daughter Maro found another one of his missing works known as Untitled, or Virginia Summer, which is believed he produced in the summer of 1947. So there goes that story. You know, it's not, I guess, you can't blame an artist or anybody for that matter of thinking they're cursed of your own mother's telling you, I have high hopes for you, but by the way, you're the dark one. It's like, okay, yeah. Plus, it must be very difficult indeed to see anybody starve, but your mother, that's got to be horrible. Now, let's go on to the next artist. His name is Ilya Repin. Ilya Repin was a famous 19th century Ukrainian painter born in 1844. He was a teenager when he started to paint, and he won his first prize when he was 25 years old. In 1872, he was awarded a commission by the Grand Duke Alexander Alexandrovich. The same year, he married Vera Shevtsova. The 15-year marriage produced 4 children, during which Repin had various affairs. In 1885, he suffered a setback with his portrait of Ivan the Terrible killing his own son, which caused a scandal, and it was removed from exhibitions. Working on this painting paralyzed his right hand, and he learned to work with his left hand. Eventually, Repin was given new commissions and received many accolades for his work throughout his life. In 1890, he met Natalia Norman, who became his common-law wife. In 1899, he built a country house called the Penates, where they lived for the next 30 years and entertained Russian society. He was appalled by the violence and terror the Bolsheviks demonstrated following the October Revolution. In 1914, Natalia sickened with tuberculosis and died. He died in 1930, aged 86, and was buried at his country house. The terrible reactions to Repin's work came long before his death. He was an acclaimed artist, but being his subject carried a heavy cost not paid in money. It seemed that many of his subjects died unnatural deaths after sitting for him. Between 1870 to 1873, Repin produced Barge Haulers on the Volga, which depicts 11 men dragging a barge on the bank of the Volga River. The men who were healthy when they posed began to die once it was completed. In the late 1870s, he painted a man with an evil eye, using his godfather, Ivan Rodolph, as a model. Rodolph was known as a sorcerer, and Repin suffered from fevers once it was finished, which might have inspired the title of the painting. It exhibited in 1878 and received acclaim. Mussorgsky, Piemski, Pirogov, and pianist Louise Countess de Mercy-Argenteau, Fyodor Titev, died during or after Repin completed their portraits. Right after the artist finished his work, the ceremonial meeting of the State Council in 1903, that's the entire title, by the way, officials who were painted on the canvas were killed during the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Prime Minister Stolypin was assassinated in Kiev in 1911 after Repin painted his portrait. In 1913, Abram Balashov slashed the painting Ivan the Terrible and his son, Ivan, 3 times while he screamed, "Stop the bloodshed!" His final destination was a mental asylum. Georgy Khrushchev, the curator of the Tretyakov Gallery who owned the painting, threw himself under a train when he learned of the act. The painting was restored with the help of Repin. It was kept on exhibition, and there were stories that those who saw it would be visited by anxiety and crying fits. In May 2018, the painting was damaged when a drunken visitor took a metal bar and broke the protective glass. It was pierced in 3 places and the frame was badly damaged. The vandal was imprisoned for 2.5 years. So there you go. He was obviously very talented. When you look at his paintings, he's very talented, but it was like, if you were sitting for him or right after you died, or was it just that was their destiny, or it was a sign of the times, political unrest. But still, there's a lot of people sitting for this man who ended up dead. Unusual. And our last article, it is out of IFL Science, and it's titled Lost Continent Argoland Located 155 million years after it broke from Australia. Geologists believe that around 155 million years ago, a 3,107-mile long chunk of land dubbed Argoland broke off from Western Australia, but what happened to it after that was unknown until now. Our planet's continents aren't stationary because of plate tectonics. Over the course of millions of years, they can join each other to form supercontinents and break apart from each other to make smaller continents. Geologists have long suspected Argoland to be one of these microcontinents, but there was little evidence to suggest where it went. The structure of the seafloor in the Argo-abyssal plain, the deep ocean basin left behind by the break-off of Argoland, indicates that the continent drifted off to the northwest, most likely ending up somewhere in what is today the islands of Southeast Asia. There's no massive continent hidden under those islands. That definitely would have made the news, only small continental fragments. So researchers from Utrecht University turned to the geology of Southeast Asia to find clues as to Argoland's fate. Using reconstructive models and fieldwork data from several islands, including Sumatra, Borneo, and the Andaman Islands, they discovered that Argoland was never a single coherent continent, it being splintered into fragments around 300 million years ago, forming what the researchers called an archipelago. An argopelago. The situation in Southeast Asia is very different from places like Africa and South America, where continent broke neatly into 2 pieces. Argoland splintered into many different shards, explained Elder Advocat, one of the study's authors, in a statement. Those fragments are now hidden beneath large parts of Indonesia and Myanmar, having arrived there around the same time. The researchers also found that the breakup of Argoland accelerated around 215 million years ago, which explains why the continent became so fragmented and why it made putting all the pieces together that much harder for the team. We were literally dealing with islands of information, which is why our research took so long. We spent 7 years putting the puzzle together, said Advocat. It might have taken them a long time, but as fellow study author Du van Hinsbergen explained, it's important to know how lost continents became, well, lost. Those reconstructions are vital for our understanding of processes like the evolution of biodiversity and climate, or for finding raw materials, and at a more fundamental level for understanding how mountains are formed, or for working out the driving forces behind plate tectonics, two phenomena that are closely related. Argoland isn't the only lost continent that's ended up being found. Zealandia turned out to be real after all, and the lost continent of Balkanatolia had a unique array of ancient wildlife. Interesting. I had never heard of these lost continents. Okay, so here we are. I will be coming back soon with more news from Eerie News. And until next time, in case I don't see you guys, happy Halloween. Take care.